Strength needs to be used to assist the speed work because that's ultimately what we want to improve. Ask any coach, any even strength coach, any sport coach, they all want their guys to be fast. And I think a lot of them associate strength with speed more so than it actually is.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one resource for all things fitness and performance in Switzerland. My guest today is Jason Feairheller, co-owner and strength coach at Function and Strength in Bridgeport, Pennsylvania. Jason, thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Thank you for having me. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago to you, I think this is one of the best up-and-coming podcasts and tons of great info, and yeah, happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, man, well, it's a great compliment to hear that coming from you. So thanks a lot for one, tuning in, and two, coming on the show. So for those the viewers and the listeners who don't know you yet, could you talk a little bit about you and what you do?
Absolutely. So I'm a strength coach along with two other guys, Marty Toms and Ryan Heichert. I own a gym in Pennsylvania, pretty close to Philadelphia. And we train primarily ice hockey players, but we also train kind of athletes of all different sports. And yeah, we focus a lot on speed and power training, more so than even like the strength component of it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what led me down the path of focusing more on developing multidirectional power and also multidirectional speed, as I think that's what translates best to on-field performance. And as far as like kind of what we can do in the gym to translate to better on-field performance.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting trend, especially now with the COVID that just hit and a lot of people being away from gyms for extended periods of time. I feel like people are coming back to those quote unquote basics that maybe they should have been doing more all along, right?
Exactly. I think it has swung so far the way towards strength, and now it's finally starting to come back a little bit. And I've heard multiple people say that strength is now kind of taking a backseat. Strength needs to be used to assist the speed work, because that's ultimately what we want to improve. Ask any coach, any even strength coach, any sport coach, they all want their guys to be fast. And I think a lot of them associate strength with speed more so than it actually is.
For you, what's the place of strength when it comes to speed? What is that actual transfer? Is there one? At what level does it apply? Can you just kind of go through your thought process on that?
Absolutely. When I'm talking about strength, I focus more on the relative strength of the athlete. So every athlete, if I'm talking about acceleration, they need to be able to handle their own body weight. And the same thing, if someone is changing direction, they need to be able to handle the load that they have as far as the size they have and be able to cut and move very well. Now, if I have an athlete going into a cut or they're sprinting really hard and need to change direction fast, they better have a very high level of relative strength or they're going to look super slow in that cut. Your body will do whatever it's capable of doing. So if you cannot handle that load, you'll do a lot more short, choppy steps before you go into a cut. And then you'll even look slow coming out of it. So that's kind of what I look for, is the relative body strength. Can they handle their own body when I ask them to accelerate or move in different positions?
I want to go deeper into your whole thought process around multi-directional speed, acceleration, jumps, and the whole works. Before that, I want to talk a little bit about you and how you came into the field. What have been your biggest influences, whether it was coaches or outside sources that have influenced you in your process as a coach?
So I'll just give a brief background. I did an internship when I was in college, and I thought, wow, this is awesome. You know, they're doing speed training, they're doing a lot of weight training and stuff. And then when I actually got a job out of college, it was so different than what my internship experience was. And I realized my internship was more about doing drills that looked cool, not necessarily functional drills or drills that actually served a purpose. A lot of the speed work turned into conditioning sessions. And that is kind of like the main thing I got out of the first place I worked. I worked at a sports performance gym. Their sessions were 90 minutes long. The first 60 minutes was all dedicated to speed work. And it wasn't necessarily a high volume of stuff. It was a lot more technique stuff. But it really kind of left an imprint on me of, wow, like if I'm trying to improve speed, we actually have to do a fair bit of speed work. speed is a skill. When you see a track athlete, they do all of their practice work. They still do skill work. No matter what level they do some level of skill work. So I think what's kind of missing now, is what led me down the path that I'm at now, is the idea of multi-directional speed as a skill. Lee Taft has been a huge influence on me as far as that goes. And I think utilizing the model of, here are the movements that people will perform in a sport. Doesn't really matter what the sport is. If someone's moving laterally, they're either going to do a shuffle or a lateral run step or a crossover run. If someone is going to move backwards, they're going to perform a hip turn or a repositioning step to go backwards. So we need to be able to do all of those things really well. So that's kind of my focus, is getting the athletes to perform those skills, perform them well. And then there's always that added component of, building in the chaotic environment or the actual true agility where there's a cognitive component to it. So that's kind of where I am right now.
Throughout your career as a coach, what has been, or what have been your favorite ways to learn new material? How do you, find something new? How do you then integrate into what you already know? What's your process, and how did it evolve throughout your career?
I think that the number one thing a coach can do is try something on themselves. So I can't even tell you the number of podcasts I've listened to over the past like 8 years. And I like the idea of learning from an expert. And when I hear an expert in a specific field mention another coach, I'll look up that coach, find out what they do. And ultimately, you're just like building your toolbox of stuff you can do. You need to be a really good generalist before you can be a really good specific coach. So you got to understand how everything can fit into one model, because then you know what should or shouldn't be in that model. And I think the thing that gets missed a lot is actual sport coaches understanding all of the movements of what athletes do on the field. We see coaches and they break down a squat, they'll break down a deadlift, and they know, all right, this is the shin angle, the hip angle, and we need to put force here and do this. But if you ask them to do something or to break down a movement on the field, they might just say something like, oh, he needs like better ground contact, or, he needs to get lower. There isn't that sort of in-depth or next level education to that piece to it. So I think understanding that, and then the other part is creating a model for your athletes. When I coach, I want to perform the drill exactly how I want them to perform it. So think of skill acquisition. People will either learn from looking at something, hearing something, or in the world of strength and conditioning, almost like giving them a constraint to kind of put them in the position they need to. So if we can model all of those things how we want to, that's going to be the best thing for them to acquire that skill to then transfer it to the sport. So I think coaches need to practice this a lot more on their own, so then they can perform it well and their athletes can see what they want them to do. Try to tell someone exactly how you want them to do a speed drill. It's going to be very difficult. And the odds of them doing it exactly how you want to, because they don't have the model in their head, isn't going to be there.
That's a good point, being able to demonstrate. Have you ever gone the route of letting the athlete execute what they think is right, and then using that as the basis to then correct them, so that they don't try and copy someone necessarily? I'm thinking especially about, for example, a start in a linear sprint. We do this quite a bit of differences from individual to individual, whether you look at the angle of the body, depending on the kind of force that they can produce at the start. Movement of the arms as well can change from person to person, and it's not necessarily right or wrong. It's just their way of moving. So how do you reconcile that in terms of keeping that individual component to each athlete, while still trying to get the kind of the shapes or the angles or the points that you're looking for across?
I always want to see them do it first without my demo or without a model,
Yeah.
because then I think you know exactly what you're working with. If they are then, like you said, trying to copy you, maybe they're going away from something they naturally do. So we just want to build off of the natural skills that they have and that they already kind of have in place, instead of maybe trying to create a new model from the beginning.
Mm.
So yeah, I have someone do the drill, take a look at it, and then it's like, what's the number one thing that could improve their position or their speed for that? And then when I execute the drill or give them the model, that's kind of what I want them to see or to focus on. And then they can go and do that. Because I think, like you said, it's very important to know exactly what you have before you start trying to break it down or fix or change something.
What are some of the things that you've changed your mind about throughout your career? Maybe preconceived notions that you had, as a younger coach that you've changed along the way as you gathered more information and evolved.
I got really into the idea that strength was everything for a brief period of time there. And I was always fairly fast. I never ran track. I played baseball, but I was always the fastest kid on the team. And I spent, a couple years just truly dedicated to building strength. And I got a lot stronger compared to where I was. And I went to run again. I was like, I'm slow. Like, like I'm really slow now. And I think yes, strength absolutely needs to be there to a certain point. But the idea of just keep on adding on strength to improve performance isn't the idea. It always goes back to the relative strength, especially someone trying to accelerate and overcome their own force. They're not going to get the angles you want. And take a look at the shin angle when they first accelerate. If their shin angle's high, it could be because they don't have the strength to get lower versus they know what to do and they're just not doing it.
I want to get into the topics that you post a lot about and talk a lot about, especially multidirectional speed and power. So I wanted to get your take on how do you structure and then progress multidirectional speed and power. If we took another example, like a squat, for example, which I know is a very small, how to say that? The squat is one movement. It's very simple. Multi-directional speed and power is not. It's complex. There's a lot of facets to it. But if we took a squat and we said, okay, as a beginner, you might start with a goblet squat and then move on to the other variations that we have available. How do you structure and progress that multi-directional speed and power aspect with your athletes, starting with the young kids and then moving up?
Sure. So when we first start an off-season program, and I'll just use a regular like summer kind of off-season program
Mm.
as an example, instead of breaking up the days of speed work, and let me just even backtrack a little bit further. We do 90-minute sessions. We do about like 10-minute dynamic warm up. We'll go through speed work for about like 20, 25 minutes or so. We'll do some plyometrics after that. And then our strength training is kind of whatever's left over for the most part. So let's say I have a kid coming in the summer. If I'm just dividing up my sessions between lateral speed and linear speed, that's totally missing the point. I divide them up by the patterns that we want to do. So we might do like a max speed on Monday, and then maybe we'll do some sort of like lateral movement, like a crossover or a shuffle. And then we can go into like an acceleration day. And maybe we'll do a hip turn day. So instead of only just doing linear or lateral, we're working on these skills kind of individually. And then as the summer goes on, we start to link more of these skills together. So in the beginning, the reps might only take about 1 to 3 seconds, very short duration. Just let me see a quick burst and stop or something like that. And then as it goes on, it might go more to like 5 to 7 seconds where I'm trying to link multiple skills together. And then as far as the plyometric work goes, the idea of multi-directional plyometrics is when we train plyometrics, a lot of traditional programs are just linear based, where we jump forward, we jump straight up, we jump straight to the side. We don't account for all of the angles that we see on the field. And it's like, why don't we do that? It's just human nature. If I were to ask someone, and I've seen this in a gym a million times, they put a mat on the ground. The mat is always lined up in one direction or the other. It's not like just laying on the ground any direction. Like our brains make us think that we always have to go like straight ahead or straight to the side. But when we do this stuff on the field, it needs to be done in all different patterns. So instead of just jumping straight to the side, maybe I'll jump kind of angled forward and punch backwards or something like that. And all of those plyo progressions are based off of the movement patterns that we're trying to build on. So if I'm doing a hip turn day or a day where I'm repositioning and going backwards, I might focus on like a punch backwards into the ground. And if you think, how often do we ever train like power moving backwards? Like pretty much none, zero. But in a defender in a game will perform that hip turn over and over and over again. So why don't we build power in these positions? So that's kind of the idea behind multi-directional plyometrics. And then as we go on, it's the same thing. I tend to like to do a lot of unilateral work because if I'm reacting to someone on the field, it's not going to be a bilateral movement where I'm able to stop with both feet and then move a direction with both feet. It's always a quick punch into the ground in one way or another. But a lot of the traditional plyometric stuff that we do is all bilateral. So yeah, I always kind of thought like, what's the transfer of all of that stuff? And I think a lot of it is great for top end speed or acceleration work, but I'm not sure a lot of it transfers over to the field as much when we talk about a field sport athlete moving any direction that they want to go.
If we go back maybe a few steps or a few levels and talk about the general framework of the industry, like you said, a lot of bilateral stuff, a lot of linear stuff. Where did the disconnect happen, do you think, along the way of thinking? Because I mean, like you said, it's clear if you look at the sport, whether you look at football or you worked with street hockey, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, a lot
Uh,
of ice hockey players. Yeah, pretty much any field sport for sure still, but yes.
Right. And besides maybe lifting someone in a line out in rugby or being in a scrum, which is at the start bilateral, but then there is always some movement foot to foot. So yeah, we could talk about that. But where did that emphasis on the bilateral side of things come from, given that all those sports are literally played one foot at a time?
Well, if you go back to plyometrics, you think about like the like old Soviet Union kind of coming up with these training programs for their Olympic athletes, and a lot of them were track athletes. So they needed to do all of these plyometrics in a more linear fashion because they're pretty much just running straight ahead for their sport. So I think we see those things and we're like, yes, all right, these plyometrics definitely improve speed and acceleration. So then we just kind of use them for sport. It's like, all right, these guys still need to be fast and powerful. But it kind of goes back to the idea that I don't think enough coaches truly understand the movement patterns that are happening on the field. And if you don't know something, it's hard to integrate something new into your system.
Do you think it's partly due to the fact, like you were saying before, we always jump forward, back, left, or right? So do you think it's just that adding 356 degrees of freedom just makes people's minds just melt because now you have to deal with so many different options that you have instead of just dealing with four directions?
I think so. And I think it also might kind of go against the idea of what a lot of strength coaches still do, where like strength is king, and it's hard. And the other argument is always, well, they get enough of that kind of work within their sport and within their practice. And my answer to that is always, but is it quality work? If I always go back to speed as a skill, if you were to ask anyone to throw a baseball, they'll have a pitching coach. They'll tell them how to throw it and their arm slot and their arm angle. Just by doing more reps, they're not going to get better. They're coached to do that. The same thing goes with speed. Speed is a skill and multi-directional speed is a skill. So we have to hone the skill first and then understand after that what needs to be done. And if if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing out there or the model of movement and the shin angle and that type of stuff, it's hard to coach that. A good example of like another reason why I think speed is a skill and why it shouldn't just be all reactive work if I have an athlete moving to the side and I ask them to stop and sprint back, all right, take a look at what the upper body is doing. So a lot of us will focus on the shin angle, the hip angle, that type of stuff. But what is the upper body doing? So if the upper body kind of comes upright a little bit and almost makes him like tilt over, that could be a lack of upper body strength in that position. So the upper body needs to laterally flex, resist lateral flexion, rotate, resist rotation. So we need to do all of those things. And if you never see that model to begin with, you may never ever even train that or even understand that. So that's why I kind of always go back to, let's figure this out. Let's break down the movements, figure out what the athlete needs. And then based off of what they need, it's up to you as a coach to figure that out. You know, if an athlete has a lot of strength, but they look slow on the ground, let's focus on things that minimize ground contact. If an athlete looks really slow off the ground, but you don't think they have enough strength, let's think about doing more jump training or kind of building force through these positions. So that's where I kind of leave it. It can be overwhelming, but that's where it's up to you as the coach to figure out what the athlete needs and then create that model.
You mentioned the importance of upper body mechanics when it comes to not only linear sprinting, but especially multi-directional speed. Can you go in a little more depth about this, the upper body component that we don't usually talk about a lot? We look at the legs, we look at how to push, we look at angles, but then the upper body is often just left to the side and we just think, oh, the arms will just follow and do what they want. But how do you integrate any kind of specific upper body work when it comes to sprinting and multi-directional speed?
Rotation is so huge in everything that we do. Anytime we stop, change direction, there's some level of rotation with the upper body. And I heard Bill Hartman mention this once, and it really resonated with me. Of think of the width of shoulders of someone. The wider someone is, the harder it's going to be for them to rotate. And he used an example of an American football offensive lineman. They need to be so big because they want to resist rotation. Where if you have a figure skater who's much more narrow, and when they try to spin around really fast, they'll bring their hands in closer to their body, they're going to rotate very fast. So that's where building strength just and size just to build strength and size might make someone less athletic. So to work on rotation, I'll do a few different things. One of my favorite things is, and I'll try to talk this out in an example people can understand. Let's say I'm just moving laterally to the side, where if I'm moving to the left, I'll lift up my left leg and I'll push off my right as far as I can. And I do that with a band in my right hand with a lot of resistance on it. So we always need to lead the movement with our shoulders. And if I lack upper body strength, my upper body is going to kind of get tilted back towards the band as I push off. But if I'm able to push and keep my shoulders in the direction I want to go, then I have good upper body strength in that kind of laterally flexed position. I do a ton of med ball throws and can kind of do those a couple different ways. Sometimes I'm trying to just produce max force where I'll put them in different positions and just throw, as hard as they can. And the other one is the idea of minimizing hand contact time. So think of like plyometrics for our feet. We think about minimizing ground contact time, but we don't always necessarily think about that in the sense of the upper body, where I might throw a med ball against the wall and, catch it on the other side of my body and throw it back. But I'm trying to do that as quick as I can, where I'm trying to resist the rotation, where it's not pulling me back fast, and throw it as hard as I can. If I'm sprinting and the speed at which you go into a cut and the angle at which you go out of the cut is going to kind of determine your body position. So if I have someone that's super fast and they're making a cut at a tough angle, they're going to need a lot of upper body strength to redirect themselves the direction they want to go, or to not over rotate in the position that it gets them out of the position they want to be in. So it kind of goes two different ways. Athletes need to know and understand where they want to move when they're reacting to someone, but they also have to have the physical capabilities to perform that exactly how they want to move.
Let's go to the opposite side of the body now, talk about the ankles. Can you talk about the role of ankle strength and elasticity as well in the lower leg when it comes to everything that we're talking about, sprinting, multi-directional speed, cutting, etc.?
Sure. The ankle and the foot is such a complicated thing when we think of all of the joints, the arches, all of these different things. And whenever we push off just in a linear fashion, just straight up and down, we're kind of training the foot in one way. But when we need to push off at all these different angles, your foot's going to be in all different kind of positions. So I love the idea of easy strength, the Dan John Pavel idea that you don't do a ton of volume of something per day, but you do it consistently over a long period of time, and that's going to build strength. So every day our athletes come in for their dynamic warm up. There's a single leg hop series that they have to go through. And it's not crazy difficult, but over the course of an entire summer, the strength that they build in their feet and ankles just from going through these, and it's variations of side to side, front to back, and all these kind of different things will build a ton of foot strength. Because when the foot strikes the ground, it needs to be strong enough that it's able to handle the load the hips have in producing the force. So if I have a very weak foot, in the sense that I drive into the ground hard to change direction, but my heel kind of collapses to the ground, I'm losing a lot of the force, the ground reaction force that I'm trying to put into the ground. So that is a huge component. So I think it needs to be trained and trained a lot.
Yeah, I'm totally on your side on that. Last year, I started working with the rugby team that I'm with now in Switzerland, and I started introducing just basic power speed drills at the end of every warm up before we went into our speed work. And it's literally just 5, maybe 6, 7 minutes of, like you said, ankle hops, marching A's, running A's. I mean, very, very simple. And 6 months later, the coach comes to me and he's like, the guys are super dynamic on their feet, even the props. What have you been doing with them? I'm like, just 6 months of twice a week, 5 minutes of power speed drills. And like you said, it's not complicated, but if you do it well enough and for long enough, you get the returns in the end.
Exactly. Use the warm up to take advantage of a particular skill that you want to improve on, and just drill that skill every single day. And then once they own that, then you can pick another skill, or if you keep seeing benefits from it, just keep doing that same skill.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've seen quite a few of your videos on Instagram, and you use quite often some boxes where either you're jumping onto the box, off the box, and back on, off the box, and then forward or to the side. So can you talk about the importance of using those boxes when you work on all those multi-directional drills?
Sure. So if I have a box, and let's just say I'm doing a lateral bound progression, so a bound being jump off of one leg, land on the other. Some might call it a hide in. But the eccentric load that someone gets is what's going to determine the difficulty of the drill. So I mentioned before the idea of developing relative strength for athletes and being able to handle their own body weight. Once an athlete can just jump straight to the side and stick that landing, and I know coaches are going to say, yes, but in sport they don't stick the landing. No, but that's not the purpose of this drill. This particular drill, I'm just trying to build strength in this position, and I'll use these boxes in order to do that. And then I will have them, instead of just going straight to the side, maybe angle forward a little bit, do that same thing, stick a landing, and then maybe even angle forward a little bit more. Then once they can do that, I'll have them move up to a box and do the same thing. And even adding a box that's about like 12 inches off the ground is going to add a lot more force or a lot more eccentric load when they come down to the ground. And then once they can start to do that well and stick that landing, they can move well at very sharp angles all the time. The other reason I use a box is if I'm like jumping up to the box, and let's say I'm focusing on like lateral ground contact now, or minimizing ground contact, and I'll just kind of hop back and forth to the box on a single leg. And this box might only be a couple inches off the ground. What I'm trying to do is strengthen the foot and the ankle, because that's where we need to think about putting force into the ground. So it goes kind of a couple different ways. And having the box there is going to subconsciously make them push harder than as if I just had them do line hops back and forth as fast as they could.
In your opinion, would it work for someone who doesn't have a lot of time to work on those multi-directional drills, in addition to the speed work that's required to then perform well on the field? Is there a place for, again, if the time frame is just really short, integrating some kind of plyos or jumps prior to an acceleration or a sprint? So for example, if we're working on 10 or 20 meter sprints, including maybe some lateral bounds, 2 or 3 of them before you start, or a couple. I saw a good video of yours. It was, you were working on a cut and you were kind of always pushing harder with one side. So you're kind of advancing to one side more than the other. You weren't doing it evenly left and right. So maybe doing 3 of those into a sprint. Would there be a place for that? Or in your mind, would it be better to separate the time and work them individually?
No, that is definitely the next phase, is incorporating these things into the speed work. So whenever people are performing a movement skill, where they're linking a skill together, or they're moving laterally, they move backwards, or they're, performing a split step where they're kind of just punching a foot back and going forward, that's where they need to put a lot of force into the ground. So let's say, and I just have someone perform the drill, like we talked about before. I watch them perform the drill. And if I know they have a good level of strength and a good level of power, then maybe I'll have them perform kind of like what you just mentioned, where they're moving to the side and they punch into the ground, the direction that linking skill
Mm,
would go.
mm.
And then I go back to the drill and have them do it. So I'm trying to create a position where they're subconsciously pushing harder as they always perform these linking skills.
The next 2 or 3 topics I have, I'm always a little hesitant to bring them up because I don't want to be the guy who just beats a dead horse again and again. But I'm generally interested in your opinion on those things, given that you are a reference in the field for those different qualities that we're trying to develop for athletes. So one of them is touching cones or lines while doing change of direction drills, because from what you're doing and from what you see on the field, when somebody cuts, when somebody does a crossover, their hands are nowhere near the ground. Their torso is pretty vertical. And what we're seeing often is people going and changing direction, but touching a line or touching a cone, which brings you fully down with your upper body, which looks nothing like the skill that's on the pitch. So from your perspective, given what you know, is there a place for it? If so, when? And yeah, I'll let you just go on it.
I never do it. So yeah, the only cones that are out on the turf at our gym here are just 5, 10 yard markers where I'm just telling someone to sprint to, but we're never actually doing that because, like you said, sport is not played that low. If I'm in an athletic position, that means that I'm not even getting super low with my hips, because if I'm trying to be super reactive in a direction, I don't have a deep hip angle and even necessarily a deep shin angle, because if I need to move fast, I need to extend my legs super fast. And that's not going to happen by getting really low. Getting really low is going to make someone slow because they have to have a super high level of strength to overcome that force and really accelerate fast out of a deep kind of knee bend or hip bend in that position.
Next one, talking about unstable surfaces, which is quite popular, let's say, in everybody doing quote unquote agility work. Is there a place for it? If so, when?
I never do work on an unstable surface. I might use like a slant board for
Mm,
foot strengthening stuff,
mhm,
but the surface is always going to be stable. Something I might challenge the athlete a little bit more by using the slant and by having them, turn to the left, to the right, so they're working the different angles of their feet. But it's always in a position where they can create stability through their hip and through their ankle. I don't want someone wobbling a ton. Sport's not played on an unstable surface. It's played on a stable surface. But yes, you might get off balance at some point, but the surface is still going to be stable. So we'll always kind of train on that. Even the idea of PVC pipes, I would consider that a stable surface. It's difficult in the sense that it's going to roll and move, but there's no give to it.
Mm.
There's my wife's a physical therapist. She showed me this study, and I forget how old it is now, but it was the idea of balance being much better on a stable surface versus people doing it on an unstable surface all the time over the course of like a rehab protocol. And the same idea applies. If I'm trying to strengthen someone's foot, having them stand with just like their toes and the ball of their foot on a PVC is going to be super beneficial for them and how it develops strength in their foot and the arches of their foot compared to something like an RX pad or something like that.
So just to come back on that study you mentioned, you're talking about the transfer from the rehab setting to then, let's say, a balance test on the floor was better by doing your balance work on the floor than it was on an unstable surface. Was that kind of
Correct.
the?
And I believe they used a slant board also instead of just like a straight foot on the floor.
Okay, and so even in a rehab setting, maybe training on unstable surfaces might not be the answer to actually regaining your balance and your ankle strength and foot strength.
Yes, I think it looks cool, but when we think about foot strength and balance and stability come through your hips. You know, a stable hip is going to create the stability. So I don't want the ankle to be kind of moving back and forth if I'm trying to create foot strength, which is the purpose of the balance I'm trying to do. Now, if someone's trying to create hip stability, that might be a way that they do it. So I would say never ever do it, but you know, it's got to fit what the purpose you're trying to do is. And every time I'm doing balance work, it's specifically for foot strengthening, not as much for like the hip strengthening aspect of that.
Yeah, next topic you're gonna love. I'm gonna talk about agility ladders because it's one of those things that looks really cool as well. And I've been known to gently bash them a little bit. I try to do it. Little disclaimer: I try to do it in a way that is a little bit provocative. And my goal with this is not just to, again, beat a dead horse. It's to try and get people to have better arguments than, hey, but we need fast feet, so we need to use the ladder, because I'm sure there's ways that we can use a ladder that are beneficial, but I find that a lot of the arguments that people usually come up with just don't hold up, even if you just compare them to doing sprint work, doing power speed drills, all those things. If you put them side to side with working on a ladder, all those would yield equal, if not better benefits, without the constraint of having little boxes painted on the floor with your eyes stuck to them. So from your opinion, is there a place for those training tools? If so, how?
There is, but I think it's a very kind of it's more like a warm up position. So if I'm trying to train my feet to be fast and powerful, having them go through a full ladder where they're like punching super fast and they might be doing like 4 or 5 steps at each box that they go down, that's conditioning. That's not power training. You know, power training is going to be much shorter reps, much more force. And how much force are they really putting into the ground? Because it's not like they're pushing themselves a super far distance away from the ladder every time they do it. So if I'm doing ladder stuff, and it's kind of like what you mentioned, I'll just pick a line on the ground and have someone do like single leg hops over and back on the line and use that as more of like a warm up thing for my feet versus an actual drill to get someone faster on the field.
Yeah, I feel like you said, everything that you do with the ladder could be done the same without one, and probably with better emphasis on actual mechanics instead of trying to fit your foot into a box on the floor.
Exactly.
What are some of your areas of interest, things that maybe you're not as competent as you'd like to be in, and that you are going to be digging into in the next few weeks and months?
Getting even more in depth in the role of the foot and how you're able to transfer force into the ground. I love the idea of kind of using the inside edge of the foot a little bit. I'm sure you've heard that, like when someone
Mhm.
accelerates, because that's what someone is naturally going to do. If I just have a high level athlete and say like sprint, they're going to naturally kind of turn out and use the inside edge of their foot. I don't want them to go too wide, but I think that's important. So it's understanding that role, because then when they're performing movements on the field, their foot's going to move in all different positions. I almost think of the foot like an ice hockey blade. Like if I were to go to one side or the other, you're using the different edges of the blade to direct your movement. The same thing with a foot. You're going to use the inside, the outside edge of your foot, the front of the foot, the back of your foot, depending on the position of your movement and where you want to go. So that's kind of the next thing that I really want to dive into.
Yeah, I remember watching a really interesting presentation by Chris Corfist on the Strength Coach Network, which talked exactly about that, about the importance of foot strength, ankle strength, and he also talked a lot about the big toe and the role of said toe in just running mechanics. Have you gone that far yet?
I have listened to some of his stuff, and I focused on the big toe. I may have heard that same thing that you had talked about, because I did spend some time with a focus just on driving through the big toe during like all accelerations for a while.
Okay.
And I kind of always go back and forth between cueing someone to do those kind of things, because in the sport, they're not going to be thinking about that, right? So I try to use constraints or something that would make them utilize that or get in a position to utilize that versus just kind of telling them how to do that.
What are some of the things that you'd like to see more of on whether it's social media or education material coming out in the performance field nowadays?
I'd love to see more coaches, and I mentioned this earlier, understand multi-directional power more and multi-directional movement more, because I think it is the number one thing we can do to transfer to the field. Because once you understand that, even the strength training that you do could be applied to that even a little bit more. You know, once you start to understand the role of like hip internal rotation when someone is cutting or moving, then it's like, how do I train that even a little bit more in the gym? And what would I do differently that maybe I wouldn't do before? And it doesn't have to be a big difference. An example would be if I'm doing a lift or a chop, I'm going to do that lift or a chop over my front leg, which would be basically forcing me into internal rotation of that hip.
Mhm.
And yeah, depending on the athlete, a good example would be like if I have a baseball hitter, he'd be doing more of like a lift. A baseball pitcher would be doing more of a chop.
Mhm.
But both of those things happen in baseball. So that's kind of an idea of once you understand that a little bit more, maybe you can even utilize your strength training a little bit more to complement that.
Can you just go into a little more detail? You talked about the lift and the chop. So I see how the chop would bring you into internal rotation on that front leg. Can you talk about the distinction between the chop and then the lift in that context?
Yeah, so, and I'll say this, when I'm doing a chop and a lift, I always like to do it with my arms straight with a little space between the band. And I'll do it with a band most of the time, because I see too many people just moving their arms and not actually rotating their shoulders, which is what I would try to do. So,
Mm.
a chop coming from a position, a low point up to a high point, lift, or I'm sorry, I said that backwards. A
Oh,
chop
yeah.
coming from a high point to a low point, a lift coming from a low point to a high point. But when we do both of those things, the shoulders need to rotate over to the side. And even like as we go into a cut and come out of a cut, we're going to get more of almost like that band lift or that band chop rotation, where we go from like a little bit lower point to a point that's just a little bit higher when we come out of a cut or a turn.
So, right. So if I understand it correctly, would a chop mean you're coming into a cut and then the lift, you're coming out of a cut? Does that make sense?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, great. Now, things you'd like to see less of, whether it's on social media or on any other medium that coaches can share their thoughts through.
Um, Probably like one rep maxes in college gyms where kids are just going insane all the time. I mean, I understand the excuse me, the culture aspect of that is huge, and I agree with that.
Mm.
But I don't necessarily think you need to do one rep maxes in order to get guys fired up to train. I think when athletes see differences and they actually see improvement on the field from what you're doing, that's what gets them fired up and motivated to train.
For coaches who are interested in diving more deeper into this multi-directional speed and power aspect of things, what do you recommend they do to start? Where do they go to look for information? I know you put out a lot of good stuff. Lee Taft, you mentioned him, and he's a reference in the field as well. Who else do you follow, or who else do you recommend that people look into to learn about those things?
You had Justin Moore on the podcast before,
Mm-hmm.
and he kind of talks a lot more about like the internal role or what's happening internally when someone is changing direction. So I think a combination of all of us will give you a good model to kind of pick and choose from for whatever athletes or group of athletes you're working with.
Jason, it's been a pleasure having you on today to talk about all those great topics. Where can people find out more about you if they want to follow you?
I posted a ton of stuff on Instagram. It's at my name, at Jason Feairheller, JasonFeirheller. I do have a newsletter. If you go to functionandstrength.com, you can sign up for a multi-directional newsletter. I put that out about once a week or so. And then I have a video for sale on the Function and Strength website, developing multi-directional power for athletes. And it kind of goes over all of the principles that I have. So it's not necessarily like you have to do this week 1, this week 2, this week 3. Utilize the principles in there and fit it to your model. So that's kind of the idea behind that.
Which I think is probably much more beneficial in the long run because you actually learn how to think about it rather than just reading a program through.
Exactly. I'd love to see more coaches understand information versus just regurgitate information and memorize stuff. Because once you have a true understanding of it, then you kind of own that, and you can really be successful in that.
Jason, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been awesome.
All right, talk soon.